Namaste, good morning, and welcome to the Vedanta Society of Greater Houston and our class on the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Om Sarva Jiva Papanashakaranam Bhaveshwaram Swikritam cha garbhavasa deha pashamidrisham Yapitam swalilaya cha yena divya jivanam Yapitam swalilaya cha yena divya jivanam Tannamami Deva Deva Ramakrishna Ishwaram. Om Shri Vivekanandari Satchishya Supujitaya Shri Sharada Devya Virata Sevitaya Shri Ramakrishna Paramahamsaya Avatara Varishtaya Chate Namaha. We salute Sri Ramakrishna, God of gods and Lord of existence, who of his own free will took on human birth and lived a luminous life of divine play for the destruction of human ills. We salute that incarnation of God, Paramahamsa Ramakrishna, who was worshipped by pure-hearted disciples like Swami Vivekananda, and who was ceaselessly served by Sri Sarada Devi, the Divine Mother herself. Om Tava Katamritam Tapta Jivanam Kavibhiriditam Kalmashapaham Shravana Mangalam Shrimadatam Bhuvi Grinanti Ye Bhurida Jana. O Lord, your nectar-like words are praised by the wise and full of auspiciousness. They destroy the curse of evil, bring good to those who hear them, and bring new life to those who are scorched by the ills of worldly existence. Magnanimous indeed are they who spread your message. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat. Om Peace, peace, peace be unto us all. So we will continue our reading and study of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Today we are on September 7th, 1883. On page 282, about 1/3 of the way up from the bottom of the page. So M says, many a times you have said that a devotee who loves God for the sake of love does not care to see God's powers. A true devotee wants to see God as Gopala, that is, the baby Krishna or the child Krishna. In the beginning, God becomes the magnet and the devotee the needle. But in the end, the devotee himself becomes the magnet and God the needle. That is to say, God becomes small to his devotee. So this is him repeating back to Sri Ramakrishna what Sri Ramakrishna has taught him. And that you find often that M will do. Well, sir, you, as you say, and then he'll say something back to Sri Ramakrishna, which Sri Ramakrishna has said before. And sometimes Sri Ramakrishna will agree with him, and sometimes Sri Ramakrishna will correct him. Here, of course, he agrees with him. But as I have told once before, I believe in this class, in some class, but it should have been this class, in 1971 in Mumbai, in the Kar Ashrama, the ashram in the neighborhood of Kar, Mumbai, where we have the Ramakrishna Ashrama, I met a Swami Dikshitananda. He was, I believe, a disciple of Swami Brahmananda. I can't remember for sure now. That was many years ago, 1971. But he was an old Swami at that time, retired and living in Mumbai. And he told me that M had told him that sometimes the master would sit with him and ask him if he had understood something and then correct him. And M took that as Sri Ramakrishna's making sure that he had the record correct. That is, Sri Ramakrishna, who could see the past and the future of anyone, knew that M was a part of his mission was to record the sayings of Sri Ramakrishna. So Sri Ramakrishna took special care in making sure that M understood things properly. And so here again, we have one of many examples of M repeating back to Sri Ramakrishna something that he had heard from him, and Sri Ramakrishna either confirming or correcting him. So in what he actually says here, he brings up the topic of God's powers. That is, the glory of God and the power of creation and destruction and the power of various manifestations. Because Sri Ramakrishna had just been telling about Hazra, his distant relative Hazra, who used to say that God is God because he manifests power. And so Sri Ramakrishna discouraged that attitude, as we'll see in what follows. And so here M is saying to Sri Ramakrishna, after Sri Ramakrishna had told about the various problems that Hazra presented to Sri Ramakrishna, the various criticisms of Hazra and so forth. So so Sri M says to Sri Ramakrishna that you always say that a devotee who really loves God doesn't care for God's powers. A true devotee wants to see God as Gopala, that is the infant or the child, small child, Krishna. Krishna as a baby or Krishna as a small child, where all idea of power, all idea of glory has disappeared, and it's just the love of a mother for her child and the miracle of the child. It's one of those things that after however many hundreds of thousands of years humans have existed, it's still a miracle, still experienced as a miracle each time it happens, the birth of a child. And so seeing that birth of a child, one is not awestruck in the sense of fear-struck or standing back from a manifestation of power, but awestruck from the sense of wonder. And so worshiping God as a child brings that, the feeling of intimacy, this feeling of possession, yes, possession, that God is my own. God is my child. God is my own, that I love as my child. And so Sri Ramakrishna would often say that the value of worshiping God as one's child is that it brings only intimacy and no fear, no awe, no sense of distance, but a sense of intimacy. So a true devotee wants to see God as Gopala. M continues, in the beginning, God becomes the magnet and the devotee the needle. And then he says, again repeating Sri Ramakrishna's teaching, that the devotee becomes the magnet and God the needle. There was another way Sri Ramakrishna also used to express the same idea. He would sometimes say that sometimes God is the lotus and the devotee is the bee who goes to sip the nectar in the lotus. But sometimes the devotee is the lotus and God is the bee who comes to sip the nectar in the heart of the devotee. That is, that the roles are reversed. And so here the same thing is being said in this analogy, that sometimes God is the magnet who attracts the needle of our heart. And we feel attracted to God and we want to run towards God. We worship God. We feel our love being pulled by God. And that's the meaning of the name Krishna. Krishna is he who pulls. Krish means to pull. Krishna is one who pulls. That is, he pulls the hearts of all devotees. He attracts the hearts of all devotees. So sometimes God is the magnet and the devotee is the needle attracted towards the magnet. But sometimes the devotee is the magnet who draws God to the heart of the devotee. So that is experienced at high levels of devotion, where one feels that before I was working to love God. I was trying to love God. I was doing practice to love God. I was doing everything I could to remember God. I was going through struggles. I was fighting against the recalcitrance of the mind, the stubbornness of the mind, which doesn't want to go in a spiritual direction, trying and trying to get it to go in that direction. So all of the work is on my part. But a time comes, we find in the lives of great saints, a time comes when that is over. Then God is attracted to the heart of the devotee. As Sri Ramakrishna said, if you take 10 steps towards God, God will take 100 steps towards you. Or sometimes he would say, if you take 1 step towards God, God will take 10 steps towards you. Whatever the multiple of tens be, that if we make an effort to go towards God, we find that eventually God comes much more eagerly towards us. And so that's a wonderful idea. That was, there were several teachings of Jesus, God incarnate in the form of Jesus, several teachings that were new emphases in spiritual life, in the religious consciousness of the world. And one of them was not man's love for God, but God's love for man. And so that Sri Ramakrishna also always emphasized, not because he was influenced by Christianity, but because it was his realization, and because he himself had that attraction for humanity. So that is to say, God becomes small to his devotee. M continues. So then the master says, yes, it is just like the sun at dawn. So the master is pleased with M's understanding. You can easily look at that sun, the sun at dawn. It doesn't dazzle the eyes, rather it satisfies them. God becomes tender for the sake of his devotees. He appears before them, setting aside his powers. So that's a beautiful analogy, that is like the sun at dawn. When the sun is just rising above the horizon, you can look directly at it. It's beautiful, it's awe-inspiring, it's attractive, but it doesn't dazzle you, it doesn't hurt the eyes. The noonday sun you can't look at. And so God, in God's manifestation of glory and manifestation of power, we stand back awestruck, as Arjuna was awestruck by the Vishwarupa Darshana, the universal vision of Sri Krishna. When in the 11th chapter, Sri Krishna revealed his universal form. And at first, Arjuna is amazed, but then he becomes terribly frightened. And he ends by praying to Sri Krishna, please, I can't bear this anymore. Please return to your familiar form so that I can look at you. And so God is like the sun at dawn, that you can look at directly and appreciate its beauty. So both remain silent for some time. M, why should your visions not be real? Now, M asked Sri Ramakrishna, why should your visions not be real? This also harkens back to what Sri Ramakrishna had been saying about Hazara, that Hazara often criticized Sri Ramakrishna and told him that his visions were not real and so forth. And so Sri Ramakrishna sometimes would ask someone like M, well, what do you say? Are my visions real? And in the case of asking someone like M, it wasn't because he was doubting himself. Again, sometimes when he was in the mood of a small child, Sri Ramakrishna, yes, sometimes he would believe anything anyone told him and doubt things about his visions. If someone, even a hypocrite like Hazara, questioned him, then he would be concerned. But often when he questions M, is to see what M thinks, to test M's own thinking. And we may wonder if Sri Ramakrishna could see the contents of a person's mind as he could, and as he himself said many times he could. Why did he need to ask him these questions? He could just look at him and see the answer. Well, Sri Ramakrishna, there are two things that should be understood. One is that Sri Ramakrishna always tested by different means his own knowledge and experience. He was never satisfied with just a simple understanding. He wanted to test things by different means. So when disciples, those who were to become disciples, came to him, he would often recognize them when they appeared the first time as a person he had already seen in a vision shown by the Divine Mother, that this is one of your disciples who has come to help in your mission. So he would recognize the person, but then he would test their arm and look at their physical signs to see, to make sure. And then he would question the people. And in various ways, he would test to be absolutely sure of things. But there's a second reason why he asked someone like him questions like this. Not just to make sure of the truth of his visions. He asked him because though he could have seen, yes, he could have seen the contents of M's mind, could have seen M's understanding, but by asking M to express it, to express something, we have to understand in a different way than we are when we're passively understanding something. You can watch a movie that you like very much, or let's say a documentary, something that has a particular point to it that you're to pick up from the documentary. It's not just a story. So you can watch a documentary about something passively. You can enjoy it very much. But if somebody asks you to tell them about the documentary, then you have to formulate your ideas. You have to reach back in your memory. You have to put the story back together in your own words. And through that, what you have seen becomes your own. A week later, if you haven't done that, if you just watched it passively, someone asks you about it, then you'll have a hard time saying anything coherent about it. But if after the documentary someone asks you to explain it, and you do, then a week later, again, your thoughts have become organized about it, and you can express it. And so again, M was to compose this gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, recording the conversations with Sri Ramakrishna. So there was great meaning to Sri Ramakrishna asking him questions and having him explain to him the things that Sri Ramakrishna had already taught to him. So both remained silent for some time. Why should your visions not be real? If they are unreal, then the world is still more unreal, for there is only one mind that is the instrument of perception. Your pure mind sees those visions, and our ordinary minds see worldly objects. So again, answering Sri Ramakrishna's earlier question from what we read last time about the reality of his visions. So he says, why should they not be real? And this is a wonderful idea. If they are unreal, then the world is still more unreal. That is, if they are unreal from the absolute standpoint, which is a standpoint that non-dualistic Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta takes, that even God, even Ishvara, is only the way that Brahman appears when we are within Maya. But outside of Maya, there is no Ishvara. Ishvara disappears when the universe and all living beings disappear into the infinity of Brahman. So that's the non-dualistic standpoint. And so M is saying that even from that standpoint, if you say that if one says that your visions are unreal, then this world, this being whom I think I am, and all of these other beings that I see are far more unreal than your visions. That is, even if you accept a hierarchy of reality where Brahman is the only absolute reality and everything is relative and therefore relatively unreal compared to Brahman, that even in that hierarchy, your visions are far more true than this universe and all of its living beings, including me, the speaker. So think of someone like Saint Francis of Assisi, the great, one of the many great saints of Christianity. If in the future archaeologists were to discover that the story of Jesus as told in the Gospels is untrue, and as we know, Swami Vivekananda himself doubted the stories of the Gospels because of an experience he had. But even if someone were to discover archaeological evidence which proved that the Gospels, as the story is told, are not true, and that's a big if. We don't know that they're not. But Swami Vivekananda never said that they're not true. He just had some doubt because of an experience he had. But say that the hypothetical that an archaeologist discovers proof that Jesus never lived, at least as we know the historical Jesus. And you were to go to St. Francis and say, well, Francis, I'm sorry, but your whole life has been based on a lie. There was no Jesus. Then to St. Francis, his reply surely would be that Jesus I see as far, far infinitely more real than you. Jesus I see as reality, and I see all of this as just a shadow. And so whatever the historical Jesus, St. Francis of Assisi and the many saints of Christianity, and Sri Ramakrishna himself had the experience of the real Jesus who was the incarnation of God, who was a manifestation of God, and who continues as a manifestation of God. So M says that, again, even if you accept this traditional hierarchy of reality according to Advaita Vedanta, and your visions are not the absolute reality, they're far more real than anything here. And then he goes on with another interesting point in this short paragraph. For there is only one mind that is the instrument of perception. That is, the mind is the only instrument of perception. It's through the mind that we see everything. Through the mind that we experience knowledge. Through the mind we experience ignorance. Through the mind we experience happiness. Through the mind we experience sorrow. Through the mind we experience liberation. Through the mind we experience bondage. So there's only one mind that is the instrument of perception. Your, Sri Ramakrishna's, your pure mind sees those visions, and our ordinary mind sees worldly objects. So whose vision is more true, his or ours? His or ours? A perfectly pure, transparent mind with no complication, with no guile, with nothing clouding his vision, with no distraction, with no impurities whatsoever. The things that such a mind sees, are they going to be less true than the things that we see with our minds, which are full of distractions, full of impurities, full of all sorts of dross, full of the cloud of the dense cloud of ignorance, the dense cloud of forgetfulness, and so forth? Whose vision is true, more true, Sri Ramakrishna's vision of things or our vision of things? So that's this short paragraph of just a couple of sentences, or 3 sentences, is an extraordinary paragraph. So Sri Ramakrishna says, I see that you have grasped the idea of unreality. So he confirms that. I see that you have grasped the idea of unreality. One other thing let me say about this, so it's not immediately pertinent to the conversation, but earlier in the conversation, M had revealed in the gospel that he had been thinking a lot about the impersonal reality, that is Brahman. He had been first attracted to the ideas of Brahman as taught by the Brahmo Samaj, that is, Brahman as God, as a monotheistic sort of a Hindu version of a monotheistic God, a creator God, and so forth. But now he was thinking a lot about the impersonal Brahman, which is surprising because M was a man of great humility, a man obviously with great devotion. But this period of his life, he was thinking deeply about the impersonal reality, that which is approached by the path of knowledge, Advaita Vedanta. And so here you see M says, I see that you have grasped the idea of unreality. Well, tell me what you think of Hazra, Sri Ramakrishna asks. M, oh, I don't know. So that, of course, was M's way of just passing on the question, not wanting to say what he really thought of Hazra. And knowing what Sri Ramakrishna thought of Hazra, he didn't want to get into it. And so he just says, well, I don't know. And then the master says, well, do you find me to be like anybody else? So here again, we see the question that over and over in the gospel you find, and in the records of other disciples who came to Sri Ramakrishna. He would ask him in the gospel and other disciples in their reminiscences, what do you think of me? So that sounds to us like a rather unseemly vanity, that if we getting to know somebody and we're always asking them, well, what do you think of me? That's that pretty soon the people will not think very well of us if we're always asking him, what do you think of, well, what do you think of me? Because we're always turning everyone's attention to me. That's not the effect that Sri Ramakrishna had on on people who came to him. And so we can see that he was not asking it from a standpoint of vanity because of the effect it had on people. People didn't think that Sri Ramakrishna was so full of himself that he always wanted to hear people talk about him. He always wanted to be in the front of attention in any conversation. Many people we know like that, but he was never like that. But he would ask people, "What do you think of me?" in order again to test their understanding. And again, as I said just a few minutes ago, he could have looked at a person and seen what they thought of him. But he didn't rest content with that. He was, again, those two things. He was always testing to make sure that through every means available to him, that everything squared, everything came together. There was no room for doubt. And he was also asking people to express their ideas, because that calls out an active property of mind, an active property of the understanding, which just passive watching things doesn't do. That's this is off topic. I'll go off topic for a moment, but that's why reading books, which is going out of style, it's a very unfortunate thing that reading books is going out of style. That people prefer to watch videos. Why? Because when you read a book, you have to put yourself into the book. It takes effort. There are only words on the page. You have to take the written word and turn it into a mental picture. You have to turn it into a story. Otherwise, it's just ink on paper. But when you read it, there's an active aspect to reading, which is not there in watching a video. Not that videos should be banned. Videos have their purpose. They're a very powerful medium. But they put us in a passive state. And we don't end up with the same information we get if we had read the same material. If we read it, we participate with the written word in a way that we don't do watching a video. And so Sri Ramakrishna, again, coming back to the point here, Sri Ramakrishna would ask his disciples, what do you think of me? And so then the master says, what do you find me, well, do you find me to be like anybody else? So oftentimes he would ask, what do you think of me? But here he's asking, do you find me to be like anybody else? No, sir. Master, like any other Paramahamsa? That is, like any other realized soul or any other saint? No, sir. You can't be compared to anybody else. Master, smiling. Have you heard of a tree called the Akina Tree? No, sir. Master, there's a tree called by that name, but nobody knows what it is. Akina means that which is unknown. Chinte parela. You can't understand what it is. You can't know what it is. So he says that there's a tree called the Akina tree, the unknown tree, that nobody knows what it is. Then M says to that, likewise, it is not possible to recognize you. The more a man understands you, the more uplifted he will be. So the more one understands Sri Ramakrishna, the more uplifted he will be. And that is true to experience. The more you understand, the more we understand Sri Ramakrishna, the more we find that we are uplifted. We can only understand as much of something as our mind is capable of understanding. And so in our ignorance, meaning our spiritual ignorance, we in the beginning don't understand much of Sri Ramakrishna. Some of us may be attracted, some of us may not be attracted to him. But with time, we begin to understand more. But to the degree that we understand him, to that degree we find that we are uplifted by the very thought of him. By the very sight of his picture, we find that we are uplifted. So M was silent. He said to himself, the master referred to the sun at dawn, that is, which is easy to look at, and the tree unrecognizable by man. Did he mean an incarnation of God? Is this the play of God through man? Is the master himself an incarnation? Was this why he cried to the devotees from the roof of the kuti, where are you? Come to me. So as we know in Sri Ramakrishna, he would go to the roof of the kuti, the house that was where Mathur Babu and the Rani Rasmani, when they were alive, used to stay when they would come to Dakshineshwar, and where there was a room reserved for Sri Ramakrishna for many years before he moved into his room, which is known as his room in Dakshineshwar now, and where the gospel takes place. And so once the Divine Mother had shown him that there were disciples that would come to him, his own disciples, then he would go to the roof of the kuti in the evening and cry out, "Oh, my children, where are you? Where are you? My ears are burnt by the talk of worldly people. Come to me, come to me." And he would cry out in anguish for his devotees. And so M asks, was this why he cried to the devotees from the roof of the kuti, where are you? Come to me. And so M is asking if Sri Ramakrishna is saying all of these things about the unrecognizable tree and the sun at dawn, which is easy to look at, because he himself is that unrecognizable tree, and he himself is the sun at dawn, which is easy to look at. And is that because he's an incarnation of God? So here, by this time, M had been coming to Sri Ramakrishna for more than a year, well more than a year and a half. He had been coming to Sri Ramakrishna. And so still you find him wondering about the incarnation and Sri Ramakrishna. He knew that he had never seen or heard of anyone like Sri Ramakrishna. And so he's still questioning the idea of the incarnation. So then we continue with there's a break in the text here. And so this is later in the day. Sri Ramakrishna was sitting on the steps of the southeast veranda of the Kali temple. Rakal, M, and Hazara were with him. He talked lightheartedly about his boyhood days. When it was dusk, he returned to his room and sat down on the small couch. Soon he went into samadhi, and in that state began to talk to the Divine Mother. He said, "Mother, what is all this row about? Shall I go there? I shall go if you take me." The master was to go to a devotee's house. Was it for this that he was asking the Divine Mother's permission? So again, we know from many examples like this that Sri Ramakrishna, everything that he did with the consciousness that he was following the guidance of the Divine Mother. And later, Swami Vivekananda, when he came to the West, he saw that everything he did was guided by the Divine Mother. And so Sri Ramakrishna always lived in that state, and Swami Vivekananda later had that experience as well. Again, Sri Ramakrishna spoke to the Divine Mother, perhaps praying about an intimate disciple. Mother, please make him stainless. Well, Mother, why have you given him only a particle? Remaining silent a moment, he said, Oh, I see. That will be enough for your work. So Sri Ramakrishna, it's not said who he was talking about here. There was a similar incident in a recent class on the gospel, and some pages back when we were reading the same sort of statement where Sri Ramakrishna, in coming down from Samadhi, is talking to the Divine Mother and asking the same question. In the same state, still in that state of ecstasy, he said, addressing the devotees, that which is Brahman is verily Shakti. I address that again as Mother. I call it Brahman when it is inactive, and Shakti when it creates, preserves, and destroys. It is like water, sometimes still and sometimes covered with waves. The incarnation of God is a part of the Leela, or play, of God, of Shakti, rather. The purpose of the divine incarnation is to teach man ecstatic love for God. The incarnation is like the udder of the cow, the only place milk is to be got. God incarnates himself as man. There is a great accumulation of divinity in an incarnation, like the accumulation of fish in a deep hollow in a lake. And so again, here he's expressing some of the mystery of the incarnation of God, that the cow gives milk through its udder. And so the incarnation is like the udder of God. That is, that where we can see and understand and receive the grace of God very easily. So the incarnation is that aspect of God, which is the grace aspect of God, the love aspect of God, and that aspect of God which is easily approachable. So in the divine being, taking divine reality as a whole, as we see it from the human standpoint, there are various manifestations of God's being, various aspects to the God's being. And that's why in some religions they stress the judgment of God, God as the judge, God as a stern judge sometimes, God as one who seeks justice and sometimes punishes people and so forth. So there are many aspects of God. There's God as a creator and so forth. But the incarnation is the love of God, the grace of God condensed. And as Sri Ramakrishna says in this beautiful analogy, like the udder of God, where the milk from the cow is accessible, where the grace and love from God are easily accessible. So some of the devotees wondered, is Sri Ramakrishna an incarnation of God, like Krishna, Chaitanya, and Christ? So again, M himself was wondering this, no doubt, and that's why he records it. And he says some of the devotees, so probably he had the sense that some of the others were wondering the same thing. So now we come to the end of that day, and we'll stop here, even though it's a little early, because the next day is there's a different topic of conversation, a different narration, and so forth. So in order to leave us with a harmonious story and a narration, let us end here. So I will give the announcements, and then if there are any questions, I will attempt to answer those. So for announcements, on Sunday, I will speak in the series Gods and Goddesses about Vishnu. No need to explain who Vishnu is to most of you, an aspect of God, a deity. So I will speak about Vishnu on Sunday. And as always, I'll try to trace some of the history, the historical aspects, the derivation of the name, different names of Vishnu, different aspects of Vishnu, etc. Uh, so that will be Sunday. On Tuesday, we will begin the study of the Katha Upanishad. This past Tuesday, this week, 2 days ago, we completed our present reading of the Kena Upanishad. So on Tuesday, we'll begin the Katha, which was Swami Vivekananda's favorite Upanishad, and one which is very poetic, which begins with a beautiful story. But then, and that's the first chapter, but then the next 5 chapters are the deep philosophy of Vedanta, expressed in beautiful poetry. And then next Thursday, of course, we will continue with the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. And so as we're getting closer to June, let me give a couple of announcements now that I will only have partial information for you now. We will announce the details as the time comes. But first of all, in the middle of June, we plan to open the center to in-person classes and lectures, Sundays, Tuesdays, and Thursdays. All 3 will be open to the public, but we'll have the chairs much more widely spaced than we normally do in pre-pandemic times. For now, we will keep the chairs somewhat widely spaced, which means there won't be as much seating room as normal. I still have to, I'm going to, as a test, I'm going to arrange the chairs and count how many chairs there are and to see how many people we can accommodate when the chairs are widely spaced. But I'm guessing it may be 20, 25 people we can accommodate. And we'll ask people to wear masks for now. And we ask that only people who have been vaccinated, who have been fully vaccinated, if it's Johnson & Johnson, that means 1 shot. If it's other vaccinations, like Pfizer or Moderna, it means 2 shots. So only those who have been fully vaccinated. Then there'll be social distancing, and we ask you to wear masks for now until a time comes when it's safe not to wear masks. So that's one announcement. And the other is about the retreat, the Trinity retreat. We're planning on Sunday, June 13th, to have an open house. So that will be the official reopening of the center, where we're open to people, but it won't be here. It'll be in Trinity, north of Houston. We'll send out directions to everybody. So what we're going to do, there's not much of a house to see. There is a building that we've gutted and we're beginning to repair, but that will take a long time to get it into shape for actual use. It won't be ready by June 13th. But people who we will take people inside, show them what we're doing, our ideas, show them the property, and then we'll have a picnic lunch for everybody. We will either have pizza or some other form of picnic lunch for everybody. And so it's really just to see the property, to spend some time there. We'll sit together, have a little discussion, show people around, talk about ideas, etc. And so we'd like everyone that would like to come to please come on June 13th to see the new retreat and what we're doing there and what we hope to accomplish with time. Again, we will send out directions, and also we will find out who has a car that they're willing to take with room for others, so that those of you who don't want to drive that far can get rides. Many of our close devotees are older and no longer feel comfortable driving for 2 hours on interstate freeway and so forth. So we will try to provide as much transportation as we can organize. So more details on that as we go. So now let me see if questions. Uh, how important are visions in the path of God realization? Can a person realize God without having visions? Yes, one can realize God without having visions. So visions, there's some people who by nature are visionary. I know people who have a number of visions, and people whom I know well, and I don't doubt that they actually see these things. It's not just an overactive imagination, and yet they're not highly spiritually developed. They have a spiritual orientation, but they haven't gone far in the spiritual path, but they have a tendency towards visions. There are other people who have gone very far in the spiritual path and have never seen a vision. So spirituality should not be judged by visions. There's nothing wrong with them. That's if they're genuine. They're signposts along the way, and they inspire us, and we do get understanding from them. If it's a genuine vision, it purifies us to a certain extent. Each such experience has some sort of purifying effect on us, inspirational effect, and all of that. But that's as far as it goes. Swami Saradananda says in The Great Master that there are those who go all the way to illumination without ever having any vision. And so the real standard for judgment of spiritual advancement is a person's character. If a person has a lot of visions and their character is not solid, then what's the value? And if a person doesn't have visions, but they have a deeply spiritual character, then they have the real thing. And so we shouldn't give too much importance to visions. At the same time, it doesn't mean that they have no value. No, they do have value. They can be very inspirational, and we can get understanding and knowledge from them. But we shouldn't use them as a standard for judging the degree of spirituality. The degree of spirituality we can tell by internal qualities like unselfishness, clarity of mind, purity of intention, concentration, compassion for others, etc. Those are more sure judges of spirituality than any vision. So did Sri Ramakrishna know all his disciples from the very beginning? I don't know if every single one he knew from the beginning, but certainly the ones I know about, he did know about them. There are many, it's recorded about many of them, that he recognized them when they first came. And so certainly the important ones, those who were important in his life, he recognized them. And that goes for householder disciples as well as monastic disciples. He knew him, he knew Balaram Babu, and other such, as well as his monastic disciples. And yes, it would be impossible to say that he knew every single one of them, but the ones that were important in his life and his mission, or I should say important in his mission, those he knew. So that is all the questions for today. As always, very good questions, which I appreciate. And so with that, I'll close with a chant. Om Niranjanam Nityam Anantarupam Bhaktanukampa Dhrita Vigraham Vai Ishavataram Parameshamidyam Tam Ramakrishnam Shirasa Namama. We bow in adoration to Sri Ramakrishna, who is stainless, eternal, infinite, the worshipful Supreme Lord who took human birth out of compassion for all. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat. Om, peace, peace, peace be unto us all.